and I was privileged to be asked to do that. And then I was asked, could I put together my adventures in living and my art? And I thought, well, that's a really interesting thing. What I'm going to do is to turn my video into a detective story. Because for those of you who know me, know that I was not doing any art, visual art, before I came to Okama. I didn't know anything about doing visual art. So this little video is my detective work trying to figure out how I got to be an artist. And the second thing is it's a love story of falling in love with art. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'd love to answer questions after it's over.
Jeez. I don't think someone's muted.
And afterwards, there's lots of art up here for you to look at that's mentioned in the show.
As you can see, Mary Sue went to quite a bit of trouble preparing for her ILR class. Only it wasn't this class she was preparing for. Last winter, we had a great series called The Artists of Okamic, and each week an artist presented their work, and Mary Sue was scheduled, but as you know, things happen. So now, you can join me in welcoming our next presenter, Mary Sue Cobble.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, all of you, for coming. It's been a real pleasure to put together the show that I was going to do for you last February and cut it, and then add to it half of this presentation as the story, The Adventures of My Life. I put this image up here, which I did, in order to cool you off, because it was in the 90s the whole time I was working on this project. As we go through this, I never in my wildest imagination, when I moved to Okamic 11 years ago, would have pictured myself standing up here in front of you talking about art. Why? I was not an artist before I moved to Okamic. I was a teacher, a writer, a poet. I had never had any art classes. I didn't know how you would do oils. I didn't know what pastels were. I never heard of encaustic painting. I knew very little about art, I thought. But luckily, this talk has given me a chance to reflect on how did my art happen. So I started this project with 3 aims. Aim 1, to tell the story of my life's journey, 4 adventures in living. And secondly, to do some detective work to see if I could figure out if there was anything in my earlier life that would have predicted that I would become an artist. And thirdly, to describe my artist journey with a focus on some of the fun ways I've learned to do art. So let's begin. I was born in a little town called Phlox. And if you recognize the flowers, these grow wild in Phlox. Every summer when we would go home to look at our gardens, the phlox would have taken over. They grow up 3-4 feet high. And if you pull them out one year, they'll be back the next spring. This is a picture of my great-grandfather and his second wife, whom everybody loved. He married her after his first wife died. And I put this picture here just to remind myself to tell you that most of my relatives came from Germany between the years of 1830 and 1865. Now, there was one strain that came through Canada, and those of you who are squeamish, close your ears. There was a very famous king called Louis XIV. He had a lot of mistresses. One of them got pregnant. She was sent to Canada. And somehow that strain came down from Canada into Wisconsin and into our family. And she is somehow related, they say, I don't know if this is true, to my grandmother who's sitting here. My grandmother gave me few memories. She had 11 kids. My mother was one of the very youngest. So by the time I came along, there were lots and lots of grandchildren. I was not all that important. But she did do something wonderful. She gave my mother, who then gave me, the top of her wedding dress. They called this a waist in the old days, W-A-I-S-T. And I had it framed and hung in my house for a long time and then gave it to the Historical Museum. My grandfather, I remember better. My grandfather was a leader. He expected leadership of my mother, who expected leadership of me. My grandfather had 3 farms. He was a county commissioner. He was president of the school board. He had the first electric generator in that part of the county, so they had electric lights. He owned the first car, and for a sideline, he taught cheese making to one of his friends, and this little cheese factory turned into a very important craft cheese factory later. One of my memories of my grandfather is he would pick me up to go raspberry picking. He also always ate his peas on a knife. And he put an egg yolk in his beer to impress the grandchildren. These are my paternal grandparents. My grandmother was an extremely elegant woman who loved hats and piled her hair high on her head. She was very creative. She made many things by crocheting and knitting. She did crewel. I know this doesn't look very, you can't see it very well, but it'll show you how she would put together poetry with her handwork. She sewed clothes for all of her 10 kids. My father was the oldest. When I was growing up, I was to learn how to sew, and my grandmother lived across the street, retired by then. I was trying to put a zipper in a skirt. So I put it in, I followed the directions, and it didn't work. So I tore it out, did it again, followed the directions, it would not work. So I asked my mother. She came and followed the directions, and it would not work. I said, well, go ask Grandma. So I went across the street, and I showed it to Grandma, and she said, oh, well, between this step and this step, you have to turn it inside out. Well, that taught me something. It's called coin, clear only if known. And don't you wish the computer geeks would follow that information? My grandfather bought some land and cleared it by hand with saws and axes and dynamite. My grandfather was a great storyteller. He would come down when he was retired, my grandmother had died, for breakfast. And he would sit at the breakfast table telling stories to us kids that would last until noon. And all you had to do was to say, really, Grandpa? And that kept him going for hours. My grandfather would sit around the potbelly stove in the gas station that my dad owned when I was a very small kid and before I was born. And he had some famous visitors. Does anybody recognize these guys? Okay. They would come to town, to this little tiny town, and they would ask my father to charge batteries. And so my father would charge the batteries. One Easter, these two came, and my grandfather was sitting around the stove, said, we don't charge batteries till you go to church on Easter Sunday. So he marched the lady on one elbow and the guy on the other all the way up the hill to church. And they went to Mass on Easter Sunday, and they knew everything to do. And later on, when my grandfather and my father found in the newspaper that this girl had been arrested. They all knew who she was. She was Billy Frechette. Her mom was a Menominee Indian, lived on the Indian reservation, and Dillinger would bring her home to see her mama. And of course, she was captured before he was. But it's a great story. My grandfather tells a story also, and the family does, of the POWs who would come to Wisconsin during World War II. And they would work on the farms, for example, during threshing season. And it was a rule that you could only feed the POWs bologna sausage and water. Now, you can't thresh all day on bologna sausage and water, according to my uncles. So, perhaps you know how threshers were fed. All kinds of meats, pork, meat. They were, on beef, they were fed many different kinds of vegetables and cakes and pies and barrels of beer. So this is how my uncles fed the POWs. Well, the sheriff came and threatened to put my uncle in jail if he kept doing this. My uncle had to go all the way to his congressman to get permission to actually feed POWs more than bologna sausages on white bread and water. Well, you can imagine listening to my grandfather tell these stories. He would pay you $1 if you would pick a whole gunny sack full of dandelions so he could make wine. My mom and dad. My dad was the oldest of these 10 kids. At 5 years old, he was already milking cows. My father had huge hands. He learned English when he went to school. Now, he was 4th generation. But my grandfather and grandmother had grown up in little communities where people spoke German. And when they moved up to flocks, people spoke English, but they kept up with their German. So my father in 1st grade, during recess, the teacher would sit him on her lap and teach her English. He took the 7th grade test in order to get his 8th grade diploma because my grandfather said, you have to go out and work, and sent him out to the lumber camps. He became a lumberjack. Later, my father in the 30s bought a gas station, and the wonderful thing about that was there was an ice cream stand attached to it. You could buy an ice cream cone for 5 cents, double dip for 10 cents. My mom and dad dressed up. He wore white overalls and white shirts to work in the gas station. And I am in this picture. I know you can't see me, but I am there. My dad bought this house, which has been remodeled a little bit, for $600. And he also then gave up the gas station and bought a store. This isn't exactly what the store looked like, but it's the best picture I could find. It became what we would call today a box store. He sold groceries and hardware and shoes and all kinds of appliances. He sold lumber. He sold the seeds for the farmers. He sold fertilizer. He sold building materials. If you wanted to build a house, he had everything you needed, and the carpenters and the electricians. If you wanted to build a barn, the same thing. I hated the store. The only thing I liked about it was there were windows in the front, and sometimes they let me decorate the windows. See, I'm trying to find out how I ever became an artist. From 7 to 8 a.m. every morning when I was in grade school, I had to go down to the store and man the front cash register before the regular people came in to serve the store, because my dad was in the back getting the men ready to go out on the jobs. My father, when he retired in front of our house, in the back of our house, raised honeybees. So I put this in here for those of you who are Okamic lovers of bees. My father's philosophy was that the purpose of owning a business and running a business was social work, to help your fellow people. And so he gave out free food when people needed it. He gave credit for everybody. He would go to the bank and take out loans for people who needed loans. Remember, these are the days right after the Depression. He worked from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. 6 days a week. What I learned from my father was the importance of service to others. Many people at his funeral came up to my brothers and sisters and me and said, "You know, you probably don't know this, but your father saved our farm. Your father saved our home. Your father brought us food in the middle of winter when we didn't have anything." And we know that this is true because we knew some of the cases, but we didn't know as many as really there had been. So I learned the importance of service to others through my father the whole time I was growing up. I also learned I would never marry a farmer. And the other thing I learned is that I was not going to be an entrepreneur because I was not going to own a business, and I was not going to spend from 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. working. Well, that's crazy, because when I became a faculty member, that's what I did. But it was the kind of work that I loved, not retail. My mother was a great influence in my life. She was a fantastic teacher. She walked to high school 4 miles each way. Now we're talking northern Wisconsin. Snow, blizzards. You've heard the stories of walking barefoot. Well, she truly did walk through the snow 4 miles each way. There was no money for her when she graduated from high school to go to the University of Wisconsin. This is now in the middle of the Depression and the drought. And so she went to what's called normal school. Some of you probably know that you could go for a year or two to normal school and become a teacher. So she taught in a one-room schoolhouse with a potbelly stove, and she had 8 grades. I saw, as I was putting the house in order after she died, some of her schedules for teaching. She had 10-minute lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history. So she had 35 lesson plans to do every day. That's 175 lesson plans per week. Notice the desks here. When I was a little kid, my mom and dad got us some desks like this so we could play school. Guess who was the teacher? I was the oldest of 6 kids. My mother, besides having 6 kids, was Dad's bookkeeper. She was a church leader, a community leader. This is the pageant in which I wore that little dress. My mother had a huge garden, and as you can see in the background, we lived near the church. And over on the right, you can probably see 3 telephone poles. My dad had those erected and then hung swings from them. So imagine how high you could go on those swings. They were wonderful. Then he had to take them down later because the insurance company would not insure the house and the yard if he had those huge swings up there. My mother was a very good gardener. She could make anything grow. And this was her relaxation, to plant perennials. And she had marvelous gardens, which later on Bob took care of. 13 gardens, yeah. My mother in the 60s, after my father had a heart attack, went back to the University of Wisconsin and lived on campus for a year. Now, this is not something that people did in the early 60s. Then she graduated with her 4-year degree, became a teacher again, and then the principal. My mother and dad were both 4-H leaders. My mother, however, much, much more important, in the sense that she ran many, many programs. They did goodwill people-to-people tours, including going to Russia. My father was the kind of guy who could tell everybody how to do everything better. So he tells these stories of how he told the Russians what to do with their skinny cows. I belonged to 4-H from the time I was 10 until I left home. I learned I learned a lot of homemaker skills. I won first prize on my bread at the fair. I sewed my own clothes, which did me well when I left the convent and I didn't have any money. I could sew. I learned public speaking. I did lots of speeches, lots of presentations, demonstrations. I was invited to speak on the radio. Now, remember, I'm talking about a grade school kid here. Got to speak on the radio, which was exciting. I got an invitation even to go down to Green Bay, which was 60 miles away, and be on television. Now, television was brand new in those days, and there were no televisions where I lived because the signals didn't go that far. So you can imagine how exciting that was. I won a week at the University of Wisconsin during the summer when I was 13 because of winning a program. And then we also won some trips. One of them was 200 miles away to Milwaukee. And my mother got a Greyhound bus, and they took the whole team, the whole group, the club, down to Milwaukee. And we got to stay in a important hotel. I mean, these are kids who probably have never been 30 or 40 miles away from town. Now, I did, but a lot of these farm kids never had been away. And we got tours of the TV studios, the radio studios, Alice Chalmers' plant, the Milwaukee Journal building, just to name a few, like the zoo. Very important for small kids from little towns to have these experiences. And my mother provided them. At her funeral, people came up to us and said, "Your mother is the reason I went to college. Your mother is the reason I have my career. I owe it to her." These were great things to hear. My mother was an ideal as a teacher. I learned from her how important education is to change lives. And she told us, she had 3 girls, she told us so often, get yourself a good education so you're not dependent upon anybody but yourself. We all did. Some other influences. This is that little tiny town. You can see how big it was. There's a church. There's a school. There's a teacher's convent. There's a cemetery. There are 3 bars, 2 gas stations, and my father's store. It's on a major highway that leads up to a resort area. On the right, on my right, I guess it's your right, is a trout stream to which people came from all over the Midwest to fish for trout, obviously. There's the trout stream. And above that was a lake. And the lake was wonderful because you could go swimming in it, but from the lake going down to the trout stream was a wonderful dam. So you could sit in the back of the house and hear the waterfall on very quiet days. Great place to paint. And this is one of those pictures I did much later in life of sunset over the lake. The Wolf River, which was a natural river which no one could build on, ran close to our house. I went whitewater rafting on the Wolf. It's one of 2 times in my life I thought I was going to die. And if anybody wants that story, I'll tell you. The Wolf ran through the Indian reservation as well, and the Indian reservation of the Menominees, the Native Americans, was 1 mile from the village that I grew up in. So we had lots of contacts with the Indians. Lake Michigan was 60 miles away. Churchill said, "We must not be ambitious. We cannot aspire to masterpieces. We may content ourselves with a joyride in a paint box." So here I am a lot later painting what I saw as a sunset from the front door of our house in that little town. When I was a little kid, my dad raised chickens because it was during the war. And then later on, he raised rabbits because he thought that would be a good way to teach my brothers about the birds and the bees. This is our backyard. Great deal of snow on the pines. So as a young girl, we had no artists in the family. I lived in a tiny town. There were no art galleries. We had lots and lots of books. There was a library 12 miles away. I took piano lessons. I sent off for a camera with 25 cents and a bunch of box stops, and it never came. Oh, I was right. I was on the radio. We had no television, and I had many, many opportunities in 4-H. my uncle brought me a huge mushroom, and I carved on it. I remember that. I had a lot of early yearnings for art. I asked for a kit for paint by numbers for Christmas because I saw it in a catalog. Now, I didn't know that anybody could paint, if they were a young kid as an oil painter or a watercolor painter or anything like that, but I thought this would be a good thing to do. And I asked for a wood-burning wand, and I tried to use that on wood, but that was pretty dangerous with my little brothers and sisters. And then I had a very early realization through art. We had a radio in the classroom, and in one grade we had a teacher who let us listen to art from the University of Wisconsin. So Wisconsin Radio of the Air taught us art. Now, imagine yourself learning how to do art over the radio. If the teacher liked what you did or the class liked what you did, the class would send 2 or 3 or 4 of your pieces from the art to the teacher in Madison. Madison teacher would say if it was good or not and send back a certificate if she really liked it. And one time I got a certificate, if you could believe it or not. And you know what happened? The teacher handed me the certificate and said, I thought your piece was really awful. It was muddy and ugly. And I thought, somebody in authority thought it was good enough to give me a certificate, and somebody else says it's awful. Well, that served me well my whole life. Don't trust other people's opinions totally. Trust yourself. Take all evaluations with a great grain of salt. My life changed when I went off to a boarding school. Why did I go to a boarding school for high school? Well, the high school was a mile away, and anybody who went to the high school, 12 miles away, had to go on a bus an hour away. And the bus was full of boys who were bullies. And girls were victims, and most of us went off to other schools. I went to Milwaukee, and I went to a high school that was part of a convent of 500 women. In this convent, the high school had about 100 kids. There were about 200 college-age women who went off on buses to the college every day. And also in this group of 500 were all the administrators for several thousand nuns from all over the United States and Europe. There were the beautiful retired old nuns with their canes and their walkers and their beautiful smiles. There were art studios for full-time nun artists. There was a whole music wing with organs and pianos. There was an infirmary for sick people and kitchens to feed 500 people 3 times a day, and laundries, and a bakery, and a printing press, and beautiful gardens, and a chapel like a basilica, with a pipe organ that would fill up this whole stage twice. There was original art on the walls, and there were art galleries. Well, can you imagine what this was like to a little girl who had come from this little tiny town and had almost none of these experiences? Plus, I was living with 90 girls who had come from all over the United States. Girls from little towns in Mississippi and Nebraska. One of my best friends was from Manhattan. I'm talking downtown Manhattan. Another one, their best friend from Chicago. And women from Central America. And all of us were part of 90 young girls. It was wonderful. Plus, we were living with these hundreds of interesting leaders, these creative, holy women around us. So, I was raised among the frescoes. My college and high school years, I had this beautiful art, the galleries, these really, truly world-famous musicians and composers among these nuns, live orchestra, choral groups that made records. There were writers there, art studios. But I created no visual art. I just was am in this wonderful, wonderful experience. And I was so taken by these nuns that I joined them for college. And I spent 16 years as a nun. Now, I'm not going to tell you all about this because if you're interested in convent life and its meaning, 4 of us in our class of 1957 have compiled a book called No One's Easy Daughters, Our Journeys of Transformation. We interviewed 39 still living nuns in our group, including those who stayed in the convent and those who left, and put together their struggles, their life changes, their insights, their joys, into a book that went to the publisher last Friday. Truly, last Friday. So it should be out in early 2017. But my nun story is really too special and too involved to explain here. I'm extremely proud of those years. Those years made me who I am. Here's one advance praise for our book. This is by a retired vice president of AARP. You've heard of the flying nun, the singing nun. What we haven't heard are the genuine voices of women whose lives have been shaped by their monastic vocation. This book is a unique contribution to that unsuspected history, composed by nuns and former nuns. So I'm going to ask Barbara next spring if the book comes out, or I should say when the book comes out, to see if I can share my nun story to those few of you who would be interested. Okay, my professional career. I'm a nun. My first few years I taught in high school. I taught literature, creative writing, film appreciation, introduction to mass media. For I was a forensics coach and traveled with kids weekly to either Chicago or Milwaukee. I was the yearbook and the newspaper advisor. You see why I worked from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. This is one of the covers of the yearbook. Do you see how I got to be a doodler? This kid who did this became a graphic designer with a national reputation. A cover of one of the Pius journals, Pius XI high school journals. We always won a national prize for the journal. I always had a craft. I caned chairs. I wove baskets. I did macrame, crewel work. I refinished furniture. I took a woodworking course. I learned to turn that whole spindle. I did pine needle baskets. And when I was a high school teacher, one of my friends was the art teacher, and she had to stay up and babysit the kiln all weekend because these things could blow up. And so I did a little ceramics with her. I left the convent in 1972 after 16 years there. And as I said, the name of our book is No One's Easy Daughter. I left and went to teach at Waukesha County Technical Institute. Here, from 1972 to 80, I was a department head. In fact, when I went in to interview for a position, I was offered, I just wanted to be a faculty member. I was offered the head of the department right away, and I said, I don't think so. Let me get to know this place first. And then I did lots of grants. I set up labs. I created a lot of special courses for people like police officers, hospital staff. I was on lots of committees, all that kind of thing. And then I went to a workshop in Maine, and I met this handsome guy. In the convent, I earned my BA from Alverno College, my MA from Loyola, but there were no PhDs in creative writing. You could get an MFA, which was another master's, but I thought, why should I get another master's? That's not going to do much for my pay scale, etc. So what I did is run around the world taking courses that I really wanted. I went to England to study Shakespeare, went to Fordham to study film, went to Westbrook College in Portland, Maine, because they were giving some wonderful seminars on new ways to teach writing. And here I met my future husband. He was 1,000 miles from home. I was 1,000 miles from home. And what were we going to do? In the 1970s, that was unusual. Now, who cares? But that was a long, long distance in that days. We've been married 36 years. My husband is a writer. He's a great gardener. He can make anything bloom. I call him my Renaissance man. Before Google, he knew the answer to almost anything. I moved to Florida when we got married to work at Florida Community College at Jacksonville, which is now Florida State College at Jacksonville. I came as an exchange faculty and then full-time. I taught composition, creative writing. I graded papers every semester, 5 feet high. I was a department chair. I kept being offered dean's positions wherever I worked, but I didn't want to be an administrator. I was a writer, a facilitator of master teacher seminars in Maine and Massachusetts, etc. I was the editor of Calliope, a journal of women's literature and art. I co-founded the First Coast Writers Festival, became a TV interviewer. I co-founded the Instructional Network. We put on conferences, which now they've morphed into an international technology convention conference. People called me a change agent for the college. I was a writer. Notice the kind of covers I picked out. The one on the right. The publisher picked the one on the left. I was an author. Here are my 2 books of poetry. Painting is poetry that is seen rather than felt, and poetry is painting that is felt rather than seen. I became an editor of Calliope, a journal of women's literature and art. Here's the first book cover. You recognize Jerry Olsman? I had lots of responsibilities as the editor because there was no paid staff. I wasn't paid either. But one of the interesting things is that we featured major artists from around the United States. And the art editor was in Washington. She went up to the galleries and found the art. She taught me to appreciate cutting-edge fine art that she solicited. And she went to places like MoMA to find the artists. Taught me a lot about the design elements of covers and layout using contemporary art. We published women artists and authors from English-speaking countries all around the world, Australia to England, to etc. We published Colette's first English publications of some of her work. You all know Gwendolyn Brooks. When she died, people were calling me up because we had published one of her only poems. We published the only place one of her poems was published, etc. Hundreds of emerging and established writers. I would get thousands of manuscripts, literally thousands of manuscripts every year to read. Another Calliope cover. What did I learn? From the art editor, how to appreciate art from contemporary women in MoMA, the Whitney, and the names of these women often show up in the New York Times. I learned to integrate art and literature and layout, which made the whole magazine one large collage. I learned to recognize the kinds of covers that sold and those that didn't, to handle printers and marketing, distributors, sales, budgets, grants, writers and artists, how to do all that. I enjoyed the art. I hated the business. So when I became an artist, guess what? I don't want to sell stuff. If you come and buy it, I'll be happy, but, it's all that stuff up there. But what I'm saying is I am not interested in the business of it all. And then I got involved in something called Women of Vision. Women of Vision, if you look at this picture, the woman on the right with the glasses is totally blind. The woman with her is one of the artists from the Kummer Museum of Art and gardens in Jacksonville. The Women of Vision, I worked with them from 1988 to 2016. These are visually impaired women who do art and creative writing. They meet monthly. The leaders are this blind woman, the facilitator, the Kummer art instructors, and me. The blind women paint, design, they build clay and other sculptures, they sketch, they interpret music, literature, and they have art shows at the Kummer Museum. They've had one at the Museum of Modern Art in Tampa, one in Miami, one at Duke University, and you'll say, how can blind women paint? And if any of you are interested in the answers to those questions, I can tell you fantastic things that we have learned how to do with them. So, here's a summary of my goals pre-Oak Hammock. I developed the art of teaching, won awards. I developed the art of writing. I was in lots of journals and anthologies and books. I developed the art of the editor. Calliope was recognized as one of the 3 best women's literary journals in the United States. I retired and I was ready for a new adventure. I came to Oak Hammock and I said, now what? And then I went to a get-together of socialization on one Sunday afternoon, and Edna and Valerie came up to me and said, hello, how are you? You're on my floor. And I said, great, great, great. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I have no idea. And they said, come to an art class. I thought, well, that sounds good. So I took classes in early watercolor, oil, drawing, and doodles. And the rest is history. This is one of my early doodles. Marion convinced me to take this to an art show that was open to people from all over Central Florida. It was held down at the Country Club. And when they started giving out awards, they brought mine up to the front, and I won 2nd place for the first show I'd ever been in my life. And I thought, my God, maybe I am an artist. This is watercolor. And you do watercolor like this by putting the watercolor on paper, and then you add lots of stuff. So all the things in the background are made with feathers, and the water is made with raffia. And when it dries, you take it off. This is an oil painting, which I did early on with Ruth Harley, who is a fantastic artist who lived here for a while. And I said to the art group that I was working with, you know, we worked together, and I said, what should I call this? I can't think of what to call this. And Nancy Green says very loudly, call it 3 nuns walking. Half of the room split out with a huge laugh, and the other half looked at them like they were crazy, because only half the room knew I used to be a nun, and Nancy Green was not one of them. The discovery of the journey. I am more fascinated by the process than the outcome. I'm more interested in discoveries and experimenting than in perfection. I'm delighted when something clicks, and today I'll just share a few of those experiments. Here's a photograph. You turn it into a watercolor, and then you sprinkle some gold on it from Marion, and then it shines. These are doodles. You can do a doodle on the left from actually looking at something like a plant, and then you make a scribble, and then you fill it in like on the right, and it turns into a teapot or a woman. Or you can play around with something people will recognize, an elephant. Or you can paint with watercolor, and then you can take a black Sharpie, and you can put a design on the with the black Sharpie on the picture. Then I took a Chinese brush painting class with Marilyn Gray, and I've brought over there on the side table all these different kinds of equipment. So there are Chinese brushes over there with Chinese ink, which is very different from regular paint and regular brushes. Then I learned how to oil paint. This is painting on glass. You put ivory soap all over the glass. Then you put your watercolors on the soap and mix it up. And then you put your piece of paper over the top of the ivory soap with the colors on it and let it sop into the paper. And when you pull it out, you see what you get. And these are the roses. I also learned how to do pastels, and I found out that pastels are chalk. And chalk takes a different kind of paper with a very rough kind of tooth, they call it, so that the chalk will stay on. This is called the nude ascending the stairs, which created a great controversy here at Oak Hammock. Does that look like a nude to you? And it's a takeoff on that famous painting, Nude Descending the Stairs. Okay, another way that you can create is to do a still life, but you show all the relationships of the still life sitting in front of each other, and then you fill in the pieces. A photograph. This won a prize, and people ask me how I did it. It's an upside down inside of a Christmas cactus flower. You can photograph very strange things. These are images that I found in water. The ghost and asleep underwater. This is done with fabric dye. You know how you take dye and you can dye your clothes? Well, I can wet a piece of paper and put fabric dye on it and paint. You don't always get what you want, but sometimes you do. And there's some fabric dye over there to show you what I'm talking about. See the difference between doing it with fabric dye and this is pastel, chalk. Again, a tree. A little poem that says, it's taken me all of 60 years to understand that water is the finest drink, bread the most delicious food, and art is worthless unless it plants a measure of splendor in people's hearts. This is fabric dye with charcoal. The splash, the power of desire. And I can't always be realistic. In fact, hardly ever. We were asked one time to do a copy of an old master. This is my copy of Ruth's The King, which is sitting over there on the side. One of my favorite pieces, the watercolor Fog on the River. This is a cardboard sculpture. What you do is have a piece of paper and then you tear pieces of different kinds of cardboard and build up a bas-relief image. And then you take a brayer, there's a brayer over there which is like a little rolling pin, and put ink all over that sculpture that you've done as bas-relief. And then after it's all inked, you put a piece of paper over the top and then put a rolling pin over the top of that and see what you get. And this was the image. This one was not accepted into a juried art show, so I took it to a meeting of artists and it won first place. So doesn't that prove what I was telling you earlier about judges? A protest piece, a family with power. You see the guns? And candles for peace. Again, this is all pen and ink with a little bit of watercolor.